All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Behind the Human. My name is Mark Champagne. I'm your host, and it's my job to unpack the stories and mental fitness practices of just exceptional humans living at the top of their game personally and professionally. Today we've got a special setup, lights, cameras, the whole nine yards. Live interview here with Flemming, who is the CEO of Galderma. We're going to touch on change, innovation, leadership, mental fitness, and kind of everything in between. So thank you and welcome to the show.
Mark, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is, I have a bit of an unfair advantage because I've spent about 6 weeks or so inside your head without you, without you knowing it. Just in terms of the research and whatnot. So I'm excited for this conversation. But to start, before we get into any of the topics, if we could just put aside the title of CEO and everything that you're doing kind of day to day for just a few minutes and just tap into the question, who are you?
Came from a small town on the west coast of Denmark, grew up also partly on an island. So that forms you a little bit when you have to take a boat to school. I think that being a physician is really what has both changed my way of thinking and is a large part what I do. I always go back to the fact of my training as a physician. I trained in pediatrics and having worked in situations, I worked in neonatology, so very newborn, very small kids, often very stressful situations. You have to act very quickly. You have to be good with your hands. You have to prioritize. It many times about survival. And you work in a team because it's not just the neonatologists, it's also the nurses. So I think I'm used to working under stress. I'm good at prioritizing, but I always go back to my roots as a physician.
So I'm curious for you, when did you know that you wanted to be a physician and start that on that role? And equally, I'm curious to see how that transition into a CEO role happened as well.
Yeah, so when I grew up, I was mostly about playing soccer. I wanted to be a professional soccer player, and I, spent a lot of time on that. And then my brother started at university in one of the universities in Denmark. And after I'd finished basically what is equivalent of high school, I'd taken a sabbatical, gone to the UK, was thinking about should I go to university there. And then I came back and I thought, what should I do? So I enrolled in two studies, actually. I first enrolled in literature, and the second one was medicine. And I thought I was not quite clear where I was going. My brother was also in literature, so I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And we were both the first academic. We came out of non-academic families. But at some point I thought, I need some money to pay for the studies. So I started to work at night as basically a nurse. And that was the way I thought, wow, now I'm really have found where I'm going to be good at. And interestingly, one of my first jobs was actually to be like a nurse assistant in an intensive care unit for neonates. So that was basically the way I would totally said, this is what I want to do. I want to become a physician. And I finished med school and I trained in pediatrics and then stayed in neonatology.
Out of all fields, and especially, the category of pediatrics, my youngest son was in the NICU for a week. He's fine now, but that was probably the hardest week of my life. And I remember thinking, I don't know how these teams do it. Because I feel like you can't be around that or you have to be around it to help. And I'm assuming you're the latter, that you could see the impact of your skill set and what you saw as as an assistant or a nurse and so forth.
So a lot of these kids are, they need intensive care. So they basically need someone that stands next to their bed or where they are. You need to make sure they have the right temperature. You're working in a room which has very high temperature. You're working in a situation where there's constantly alarms going off. These very small kids are really often intubated. They have all kind of IV lines going in. Yeah. There's alarms going off. There's a lot of stress. And then all the time, you can be called to the OBGYN department for another delivery of another high-risk baby that you have to immediately put on life support. get back into the NICU. So yeah, you really learn how to constantly work under stress in humid conditions, in teams. And it basically is something that you will never forget. It's the way you think, it's the way you act the rest of your life. So most other things you meet in life gets into perspective because, and of course, you often had the very unpleasant situation of talking to parents that, for instance, have gone through in vitro fertilization. They're maybe a bit advanced in age. They get this kid. The kid comes out extremely early and does not survive. So you also have to get some really tough discussions. So you learn all aspects of life, the early parts of life, really at a very early age.
Quite quick. So Flemming, how did you, in that period of your life and through that profession, because I'm already starting to see the links in terms of what you do today. How did you handle that level of pressure and stress? And did you have any kind of techniques or practices to leave some of that behind in the hospital? Because you can only hold space for, I mean, I understand when you're in the hospital and having experienced this, the team was so powerful, for us as parents. But then when you go home, I mean, there has to be some sort of disconnect from that situation or you'll, melt down. You can only handle so much pressure.
Yeah, the first thing is, of course, you need to stay physically fit because when I trained, the working hours were crazy. You were basically on call for days and mostly at night all the time. You had weeks where you basically were working all the time. So you really needed to put time in for physical exercise. And going back to that, I also wanted to study literature. So I used some of my spare time to read or basically relax or do other things. But you need to get your mind around something else because it becomes all absorbing. And if you can't deal with the stress, then it's really difficult. And you're not at your very best. So I think I learned when I'm there, when I'm at the clinic, when I'm dealing with this, I'm 100%, maybe 150% there. And when I'm not there, I'm somewhere else. But given that I basically lived at the hospital because, as a resident, you basically were at the hospital all the time. You had to do something, and physical exercise, playing soccer, and participating in some other things like reading a lot were absolutely necessary.
What kind of stuff do you read?
So a bit unusual. So I like to read more classical literature. One of my favorite authors is Chekhov, who was also a physician, who unfortunately died of tuberculosis. So I like to read, classical literature and short stories like Chekhov. I think is one of the best at writing short stories. So I like reading that. But I go back and read a lot of stuff that most people will say, "Why do you read this?" I stay a little bit away of the latest fashion or the latest hyped novel because I think there's so much fantastic literature. But I often go back to some of the same sources, and Chekhov is a constant source for me.
What do you think it does for your mind when you read things from Chekhov and these short stories? And as you say, kind of, I wouldn't say it's abnormal, but you're right. I mean, because we don't hear, I'm sure a lot of people read this kind of work. Obviously, they're classics for a reason. People don't talk about it. Right? They don't talk about the why behind it. So that's what I'd love to know. Like, what does it do for you?
Yeah, what I like is, I mentioned I wanted to study literature. What I think is really the most difficult in life is to take a complex situation and describe it in a few words or a few sentences. And I think if you look at someone like a Chekhov or others, their ability to describe something in very few words is really impressive. And I think that's really, it takes much more work. I'm sure many, many more editions before you get to that. That's really amazing. And I think the insight into human behavior, I think you have to also realize with a person like Chekhov, who's a physician, often quite poor, practiced as a physician, wrote short stories about people often in tough conditions, and also knew all the time that he had a death sentence on top of him with tuberculosis, which was incurable. He died eventually of tuberculosis in Germany at a sanatorium. So I think that just puts the whole thing in perspective.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, I am by no means comparing myself to any of the authors you're talking about, but having written my book, It is so hard to distill concepts and thoughts into, like you said, very few words, so that anyone can pick it up and see the relatability. Even, I do a lot of talks for companies. The worst is when they say, yeah, we'll do the keynote, but can you do it in 20 minutes versus the 50 minutes? That's harder than, if it's less content, you've got to be concise, you've got to bring people in and so forth, right? So that's a skill set in itself.
But I think even as a physician, of course, when you're a physician, you like to read literature, you a little bit drawn towards other physicians that are also writers, because you can see the insight they had from their medical practice. But I think, the ability to distill problems into simple things and focus, I think is pretty transportable, not only to medicine, but you certainly can also use it in a role like the one I have today.
Yeah. Well, I assume it trains you to ask really good questions.
Yeah, and look for the small details. Sometimes it's the details that surprises you. I think people say, wow, you shouldn't be obsessed about details, but often the devil is in the detail.
Yeah. So let's continue. Where did you go from there? Because you're not a practicing physician right now. What did that transition look like, and why?
I trained in Denmark, and then I went to France to train further. But paying for medical school, paying for everything was a bit tough. So I also used my vacations to go to Sweden. And I went up to the north part of Sweden by Kiruna. So you would basically be the only doctor in a very, very big geographical area. And there, even though you were focused on pediatrics, you had to deal with many other patients, emergency room. And again, here, it was like you learned a lot about, how do you deal with stress, challenging physical circumstances, intense cold, accidents coming in, people with frozen fingers and other things and other accidents. So you really learned to operate and to think under extreme circumstances. And at some point, I took all of this, and I think the director of the University Hospital of Copenhagen, called Rigshospitalet, before that, he was managing major administrations in Denmark. And at some point, he came to me and said, hey, I think you'd be a good representative of the young physicians at the hospital. Mm-hmm. And then he came to me and said, well, I think we should involve you in this reorganization project. And they worked with McKinsey at that time. They took this hospital and they wanted to make it into different divisions. One of them was combining OBGYN and pediatrics into kind of a mother-child unit. So this was my first exposure to that. And a few years later, they helped me get to Harvard to do an MPH, also focusing on healthcare administration, because I thought, hey, this is perfect fit for me. I'm a physician, and maybe I can be a hospital administrator at some point. So, but then when I was at Harvard, it was so mind-blowing to me what all the other things you could do with kind of a business background and an administration background. And then I decided, after I'd been going back to Denmark for quite some time, finishing my physician education, I basically said, well, let me try something else. And I went into research. I started with Merck in a research position.
Okay. And because your background or your family upbringing, this wasn't the path that, your parents or where does this passion for business come from? Where did the spark come from? Do you know?
Well, as I said, the academic part was pretty unusual. I was the only one in the family, together with my brother, that went to university. My friends were also like me, playing soccer all the time, and many of them ended up like postmen and others. We lived in a town that was also a big fishing town, so they were also fishers. So it was a bit unusual, but I think it was not one specific thing. It was gradual. It became gradual. And I think when I got into something, I really put my mind to it. And when I got to Merck, where it was more in the research and outcomes research area initially, I kind of figured out, if you want to get further along, you need to understand business. So I went to my boss, and he thought it was pretty crazy. I said, send me into the field. I want to go out and work in the field as a rep and as a manager. And that's when my career took off.
Wow. I'd love to know a little bit about what it's like being a CEO at your level, because I think for those of us who aren't, running multi-billion-dollar operations and working on, was it $60+ million deal with Shire and Takeda. Like, what do we not know about your position?
The way I focus on the CEO job is, whether it was when I was CEO of Shire or now at Galderma, it always starts with the same thing. I need to understand, what is the business plan? Where are we going to be in 5 years? What are the drivers of the business? How do we set up the business? How do I build a team? What performance criteria we're using? So for me, it's a little bit going back to the physician part. If you come into an emergency room, or if you are in a neonatal intensive care unit, you need to figure out what's the diagnosis here, what's the treatment plan, how do I get a team around it, what are the interventions we need to do, and then lay out a plan. And then I think it's no different in business. You first diagnose what's the challenge, you lay out a plan, and then you find a way with the team to execute on the plan.
Do you have a certain routine or any kind of rituals or practices when you start big projects or new initiatives like this, where you're going into a situation asking really important questions to gather the data and whatnot? Is there something that works well for you personally that allows your mind to be a little bit calmer and allow the answers to surface as you're going through this thought process? Like, what does that look like for you?
So I like to have 3 to 4 months where I think and study. So when I became CEO of Shire in 2013, I agreed with the board that I would basically shadow the outgoing CEO. That's always very difficult because people get confused. Are you the new CEO or are you the incoming CEO? But it gave me 3 months to travel, see all the subsidiaries, get an idea about the business. And one of those aha moments that I got at Shire, which was a visit to Boston. They had bought a small business in Boston, which was in rare diseases. This was a neuroscience-focused company. ADHD was their big business. So after 3 months, I thought, no, we're going to pivot this company to be a rare disease company. So we changed everything. We focused on the smallest part of the business, which was a rare disease business, and built it into the world's largest rare disease business, which was then sold for $62.5 billion. US dollars.
So
and it was what I learned in those first 3 months that allowed me to figure out where we're going to go, where's the opportunity, where should we focus the business on. And with Galderma, I had the same opportunity. The owners approached me in February of 2019. Remember, they bought the business in June and took it over in October of 2019. So I spent 3 to 4 months study every single detail. I was sitting in on lots of presentations by Nestle that were selling the business. I went to visit manufacturing sites. I spoke to a lot of people in the business. I traveled around the world, and it allowed me immediately, when we started, to not lose time. I knew exactly there were 3 areas we should focus on. There was aesthetics, there was consumer, and there was prescription medicine. And then we orchestrated the business around that. And again, those 3-4 months were pivotal to developing a crystal clear strategy.
You're probably answering my next question that was coming up as you were saying this, but because I wanted to ask, like, how do you have the confidence to make big decisions like this? But it sounds like you're going into that decision with a lot of data. Right. It's not just a random decision. It's months of study. And it kind of reminds me, probably it's your version of doing residency within these organizations, right?
Yes. So of course, one thing you learn in residency is, of course, that you really need to know your stuff. And then you have to respect for the fact that there's other people that know more than you.
Yeah.
Practice is really important. And then when you have done the diagnosis or the analysis, the good news about the medical world is there's always other people around the table. There's round tables where you discuss the case, so you get challenged. And I think the good news is in business it's the same. I try to surround myself by people that we can do kind of a round table, that they will basically challenge, so that it's not only you, because we all have our biases. So you need a group of people around you that can challenge you, or whether they're on the board, whether they're owners, whether they're colleagues. It's the way of making sure that once you get going. But I think once I get going, I'm pretty steadfast. I think the thing that you cannot do is procrastinate. Once you set the plan, once you say this is what we're going to do, I think I'm pretty good at sticking to that. And what I see a lot of people do is they have a plan for one day, another plan for the next day. They change strategy all the time. when you look at what we did at Galderma, we changed the logo, we changed the website, we changed the way we operate, the way we talk about ourselves, the way we organized ourselves. It was crystal clear from the beginning.
Okay. That's inspiring. It's impressive. I love it. I'm going to pivot a little bit here, but there's a quote that I pulled from a recent documentary on Roger Federer, who I think you guys know each other personally. Maybe he said this.
I even had lunch with him not too long ago.
Okay, so maybe
not alone, but together with
sure.
some other people.
Maybe he brought this up, but I saw this line in the documentary around exactly the same time I was preparing for this, and I couldn't help but think there's so many parallels from what I was hearing doing pre-interviews with your colleagues and so forth that relate to this. And so this is what he said. He said, people would say my play was effortless. I had to work very hard to make it look easy. Effortless is a myth. Any initial thoughts just on that line? And I have some questions for you, of course.
Yes, I mentioned I had the opportunity together with some other people to have lunch with him. He was basically doing a promotional tour.
Okay.
He's come out with a book. So one of the things which I really could identify with, and of course, no comparison, he's unique and is absolutely in any aspect, both as a human being and as a sports person, tennis player, just a totally unique individual. But one thing is also, if you ask someone about what was the formidable years for you, and it was basically when he left home when he was 14, and he was sent, he lived in Basel, and he was sent to the Geneva area, and was sent by himself between 14 and 16 to be there, play tennis. And he said it was really hard. It was really hard. But the discipline, the stamina, the way that, he learned how to deal with pressure, rely on himself. It's a little bit, you asked me before, I think I learned some of that in medical school and working in neonatal intensive care units. You always have kind of some part of your life that is formidable that you take with you as you go forward.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. I mean, for me, I'm a big fan of tennis, and watching Roger play to me is the definition of being mentally fit. I know at the very beginning of his career, he'd have a little bit more emotion and whatnot, but the vast majority of his play, we see a really level-headed individual in the highest of pressure situations where his opponents, are flying off the rails and yelling at the refs and so forth. But it just seems like he's got this steadfast mind. And I can see where that effortless, component comes into the mix. And I saw that in interviews when people would talk about you and the way you set vision and the way that, this is a real life example. I mean, you're just coming back from 17 hours of travel and delivering, I imagine, a completely different conversation and perspective, but you're here, you're present, and you're making it look pretty easy, where there's a lot in the background that we don't know, right? So for you, how do you do it? Like, how do you make some of these elements look effortless?
Well, I think you always have to put your job into perspective. If I compare this job to being in a neonatal intensive care unit, everything is really in perspective here.
Sure.
But I think you carry responsibility. Here you carry responsibility to a lot of stakeholders, investors, your team, your colleagues, people that have put faith in the business or money into the business. So I think the best you can do is you need to make sure that you're really all in. And I think that's really important for me. I want to be all in. I feel I've been gifted with an opportunity, and I need to do the best I can with my team. So I think you're in a privileged situation. You should never forget that. But you're also in a privileged situation where people want you to deliver. You have to deliver. And I think you have to come to terms with that pressure. And I can live with that pressure because I've lived with pressure, I would say, all my life in different jobs, particularly as a physician. But I think the effortless is just what is the appearance outside. It's
exactly
hundreds of hours of study, analysis, thinking, even when I'm running, even when I'm with my kids, even when I'm doing something, I'm always, I would say, somewhere thinking about the business. And I always write little notes to myself. I always say, how can we improve things? But it goes back to this issue. For me, it's really important. I know what the plan is. I know where we're going to get. I know what the goals are we have to achieve. The thing that I always have to adjust is, how do we get there? Is there a smarter way? Is there a better way? But I never steer away from the overall plan and the overall goals.
What do you struggle with? Whether that's a skill or, mental narratives and so forth. And is there something you're doing to try to, work on that? Because we're all human, of course. I mean, there's things where they're, sometimes self-doubt or, am I making the right decision, so forth. Is there anything for you that, you're also working on?
I would say the biggest challenge to avoid the distractions.
Yeah.
You get so many invitations, so many meetings, so many things you can do. And that's a constant struggle to be friendly and say no. Because honestly, I get more inspired by being with physicians in China, being with my team, understanding what's going on, being at the forefront, being at conferences, being at our educational events. And you constantly have to battle. You have to constantly say to your assistant, yes, it's really interesting, but where does that fall in our priority? And I would say calendar management is the biggest challenge that I constantly am struggling with. And because there's so many things that are nice to have, but where you say, is this really where I should focus my time? And you have to be very careful because some of that plays to your ego. People, of course, go to you and say, oh, we want to be the keynote speaker, or we're going to do this article, and you really have to battle that. You have to say, I'm not here to be a keynote speaker. I'm not here to polish my own ego. I'm here because I'm entrusted to do a certain job. I have a team. Everybody relies on me. The investors have built trust in us. They've invested money or other people's money into the company. So that's what I should be focused on. And that's a constant battle. And that's when I, on Sunday evening, look at my calendar, I always plan ahead.
Okay.
I sometimes say, why did I say yes to that? I should not have said yes to that.
Yeah.
I was too nice. So one thing I would like to be is less nice with things that are less important. That's what I should be working on more.
To your point, sometimes we say yes to things that are farther out, and then we get to that moment and you're like, oh, shoot. It doesn't.
Yeah, but it's also, it's not only the calendar management, it's also how you manage your own ego. For me, I like to be an anonymous CEO. I don't want to be someone where the show is about me, because it's really not about me. You're CEO for a period of time. I don't own the company. There will be, I'm sure, another CEO one day. There will be other investors. And I think you really have to be an anonymous CEO. Not that no one knows you, but you always say, I'm second or third in this show here. I'm not the main character here. The main character is the company, the performance, what we do for patients. That's what's at the forefront. It's not me. And, you have a little bit to look at your own human frailty and sometimes say, is this for me or is this for the company? And I think that goes back to this Checo thing. One thing you learned by reading Checo, even though he was living with tuberculosis, even though he was under often challenging personal financial situations, it was always about describing and always at the same time working as a physician. It was less about him. It was more about other parts of him, his career as a writer, his job as a physician. And I think that is why you learn so much from people that are under much harder circumstances. They learn how to focus.
Yeah. A friendly Canadian challenge here to you, because having interviewed a lot of people, ego does often come out and you can feel, and I don't feel that with you. You're a very humble person and you've got a tremendous amount, I think, to give. I mean, obviously I'm very grateful for this interview and we're pulling a lot of this out. Maybe it's not this phase in your life and your career, but I feel, an interview circuit, maybe it's that, maybe it's a book and you're going back to your literature desire. But there's a lot of really powerful ways of thought that you're sharing and the way that you view the world and so forth that I think has a exponential or can have an exponential impact across the world. So maybe not now, maybe this is just a preview of that, but at one point I just want to plant the seed selfishly because I'd like a little bit more Flemming, wisdom, in this world. Because it's
well, I think the other thing that when much is given to you, you also have to give. So I decided about a few years ago that in the small town where I live in Switzerland, I saw they had a struggling soccer club, almost went bankrupt. And I didn't have much time, but I inserted myself, also making sure that I saw there were so many parents that were unhappy with their kids couldn't play soccer. There was not enough soccer field. They couldn't find enough coaches. And the waiting list was very, very long. And everybody complained about it, but no one was doing anything.
Sure.
And as my youngest was playing soccer, I was hearing all these parents that were complaining. And I was looking at them, and many of them had pretty good jobs. I was saying, well, why are you not a coach? Why are you not doing something? So we decided as a family we should do something. My wife had never coached soccer, so she decided to become a coach. And I thought, well, I can probably administer a little bit. So I became a president of that little club, which means spending a lot of time figuring out whether we can get more pitches, whether we can get more referees, whether we can get more. And I think that's another way of saying you also have to give back. You know, if you're in a community, you also have to give back. It's such a pleasure to see the parents, and they, of course, all dream that their kids are going to be Messi or Ronaldo or whatever it is. But it's such a pleasure. You know, I watch a lot of those games, and it's just a pleasure that the parents are happy. I see we also put a system in place where we went to the parents. We said, well, if you can't get your kid into the club because we have a long waiting list, if you become a coach, we will put you to the front of the line. And, you know, just to see, you know, this phenomenal thing where mother or son or mother-daughter or father-son see that, you know, my father is my coach, you know, and how proud they are of that. And I think, you know, they're not all going to be Messis or Ronaldos, but I think it's a nice way of seeing how families gel, how people, you know, also can, you know, really enjoy the physical activity of soccer, and they get a love for some sport that they can take with them, whether they become Messi or Ronaldo.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm going to pivot a little bit, but I think there is a link here around when it comes to business and what I've heard you describe as an operational rhythm. I mean, you said this with soccer. There's the families gelling, and there's a system that's typically in place to allow all this to happen. I pulled a quote from this book, CEO Excellence, which you're featured in quite a few times. As you can see, this thing is tabbed out and highlighted quite a bit. The quote that I'd love to read to you and have a chat about is this one. It says, you said, when people know there's an organizational rhythm, it allows them to be more efficient. And then I'll jump ahead a little bit. You also say, creating the right operating structure for my team that is intense and focused enables me to both best leverage the great people that work for me and ensure I have the right amount of time outside of meetings to think, or coming back to the thinking again, and meet with customers, of course, stakeholders, take time off, exercise, and so forth. I'm curious, because I get to work with a lot of different teams, and I feel like an operational rhythm is sometimes not there or is unhealthy. Let's just put it from that perspective. Where do you start when it comes to trying to instill a healthy operational rhythm to essentially, you know, give a system or the confidence for teams to follow that plan and that vision that you've, you know, crafted with the organization?
Yeah, I think I've always been obsessed with structure and process. And some people say, wow, that can be really challenging in organizations. But I think if you don't have structure, process, and organization, it's really difficult to be successful. And going back to my neonatology days, you know, you would meet in the morning. The person that had worked overnight will give you, for each patient there, would tell you what was going on. You would walk around to each of the patients, and you would basically be getting a report of what had happened during the night. And then you would take over. At lunchtime, you would meet with all your colleagues and go through treatment plans. And at evening or night, you would give it to someone else, or the day after, depending on how long you would be on call. So I learned early on that this rhythm and organization is really important. And when I came to Galderma, I would say that was really lacking. Okay. They met, I think, once a month as a big group. So I basically like to divide the world into what are the problems we're trying to solve. So in a business, one of the problems is you have to be performing commercially. So I created what I call the inline committee. We meet every month. We go through each of the main geographies, each of the main products. All the relevant stakeholders are around. If you have decisions you need, you come there. If you need resource allocation, that's where you go. Then I did the same for R&D. I basically created a R&D committee that meets once a month, and we also talk about business development. Same rhythm. We get an update on the project, we make decisions, we prioritize or reprioritize, and then, of course, in a business, you need to allocate capital. So we create a corporate committee, and in that committee, we also say, can we afford new colleagues? Which kind of colleagues? So by 3 simple committees that meets the same week every month, then we basically create a system where all the questions you may have, whether you are a country manager, you know where to go. And on top of that, I put a small committee, which is the executive committee, and we're dealing with if there's conflicts between those committees or if there's something the owners or the board of directors needs to know. So it's a super simple, very efficient, very transparent, and the minutes for these meetings, barring anything super secret, is pretty well known in the company. So people know where they have to go, and they can go once a month. And instead of having thousands ad hoc meetings and unclear, this is where we go. And the agenda is the same. I also basically said at all meetings, we have 3 themes we talk about. People said, Flemming, this is ridiculous. How can you have 3 themes? I said, no, my world consists of 3 problems: performance, platform, and growth. I said, is your problem about performance? Then we talk about this. Is it about the platform? Do we need more HR, more systems, IT? Or is it about growth? Is it something we invest? So all of those committees, all the presentations are basically based around these 3 principles.
Well, it strikes me this is, again, a way to have a defense mechanism against distraction, right? Bringing people back to this is what we're doing, especially because even outside of Galderma and our professional lives, we just step outside into the regular society. It's nonstop. The content, the news, the fear-based headlines, it's just constant distraction wherever we go. Right. So this is
well, it goes back to the calendar issue we talked about, because initially it was like everybody came with ad hoc issues. And I basically said to my assistant, let's put them into the boxes. Does this go to the inline committee? Does this go to the corporate committee? Or does this go to the pipeline committee? Because if we inefficiently constantly have these one-off meetings, it takes time away from seeing doctors, seeing patients, going to meetings, focusing on our customers. So it's calendar management.
So, and I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming then that there is an expectation as well that you have those meetings. There's probably some action items that come out of them, that the cadence of the decisions or the action, like taking the steps forward, so it just doesn't keep rolling into each meeting. The understanding is we're going to get this done, in an efficient and quick manner. And the next time we meet, we're dealing with something else. Is that how it rolls out, or is it?
Yeah, so it's very template driven, but not with thousands of slides. But all of the presentations have to end with one presentation or one slide that basically says, my asks. What are you asking us to decide, or what is it? Because I think the focus, when people come with 20 pages and they want to talk about whatever the performance of the business or the research project, I always say, what's your ask? My asks. So then every meeting, we go back and look at my asks. Which ones did we prioritize, and what was the action you took based on the ask? Or if you asked for something, did you implement it? So it's pretty simple system.
In a company that is a high performing company, right? And as you said, there are performance objectives to hit. I mean, you're delivering, board presentations and meeting and so forth. There is an expectation there. How do you view, or how do you balance high performance, but then also we're working with humans and, their minds are full, their minds are stressed with all the things we just talked about. Like, how do you bring in that empathy piece around, there's got to be a balance here, because we can't burn people out, of course. And, they want to be here, which I think from my research, for the most part, seems like that's where the vision comes in and so forth. But do you have any strategies, any practices or direction to help with that balance?
I think if I look across Galderma, we have, I don't know how many subsidiaries that are best places to work. So I think we have been able, not perfectly, to strike a bit the balance between performance and also managing stress. But it's interesting. When I started, it was not a very well-performing organization in 2019. And if I compare the mood in 2019, where the work stress was significantly less than it is now compared to now, I think the mood is much better. So performance is also something that drives a reset of the mood. If I go around, I can almost sense a little bit without looking at the numbers, whether this is a high performing or not a high performing organization. I just came back from Asia Pacific, and we have a lot of high performing countries there. And typically there, it's more about how do I get more resources? How can I do more? If you then go to other countries that are not so high performing, you can sense that it's more self-doubt, it's more negativity comes in. It's probably more a sense of pressure. So I'm not saying that if you perform well, pressure goes away. But if you perform well, if there's a positive attitude, if trajectory is great, if you're gaining market share, you somehow as a person in an organization can sustain more pressure and turn more pressure into positive energy. If you start losing, well, then also the energy gets drained and people get more negative. So it's not either or. Of course, you need to find a balance, but the best cure if people are down or if the organizations have issues is to also create a situation where they have successes, where people celebrate successes, they feel they are winning. And I think as a CEO, when I came in, the growth was really not very strong. And now we have very, very strong growth across the world. And people say, why do you take something that had low growth to high growth? Actually, we didn't buy stuff. We didn't launch a lot of new stuff. It was incremental. We did everything a little bit better. We were a little bit more focused. We did a little bit more focus on the right products. We did more prioritization. We invested our dollars in the right way. So it's a little bit like, how does one soccer team continue to win and another almost with the same set of skilled players? Well, one may practice more. One may be always that little edge ahead. So success and growth also comes from incremental. And I'm very much, as CEO, focused on how do we constantly focus on that little increment? How do we basically do everything a little bit better?
Mm-hmm. Well, then it feels attainable as well from that perspective, right? It doesn't feel like there's such a huge gap to play with that. This is impossible to get to this point, right? And I think
that's why I don't like when certain executives that have insights into what's going to happen in the next 5 years, when they walk around and talk about, oh, we can double this or we can do this. It doesn't really motivate people because people are much more motivated by things they feel is attainable, something they can do. If you look too far-fetched, if it's too theoretical, if it's too far out, people lose focus.
Yeah. I'll give you, there's some really interesting data that's from this year that Indeed came up with. And they've got I didn't know this until this year, but they have the largest workplace well-being data set in the world, 250 million data points, 24 million survey respondents. And in the report this year, they created a fictitious portfolio of companies that were their top 100 companies, to your point, where they're ranked as, good places to work and they have the highest well-being scores. They put those companies into a portfolio, and that portfolio outperformed the S&P 500 by 11%.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, as someone that works in the space of mental fitness, and I think as humans, we can all appreciate when our minds feel like they're flowing in a good state, we typically do really good work as well, right? But I love your perspective on that balance of, we also recognize that progress and a sense of, like we're doing this as a team and we're performing well. Because I've been at other companies where, it's just constant restructure after restructure and the growth is going down. It's just not motivating. So it's striking. I think it's striking to your point, that balance of, we need to make sure that our minds are somewhat healthy and we're surrounded, we've got some tools and some culture to support that, but we need to be attached to that vision.
Yeah, I think also if you have growth, even though, and people focus on incremental growth the next month, the next quarter, I also think it becomes more attainable. People can more feel versus something that it feels unattainable. The other thing is also empowering people. If I feel that I can play a role or I get recognized for playing a role, whether I'm in Thailand or whatever it is, if I get recognized, if I feel I'm on stage, I win the CEO award, I get recognized, I'm on the company website as a great performer, people, they go the extra mile.
Yeah.
If it all feels anonymous and all buried in plans and long-term perspectives, people lose it. Because I think many times when one of the things I observed, and I was really surprised in 2019 when I showed up in October, because I thought, this is a good business, but there was no passion. I didn't see the passion. Do you like your products? Do you feel engaged? The discussions were a little bit like without passion. I thought they had these great products. So I think one of my roles as CEO initially was to create passion. Hey, I think aesthetics is great. Oh, I think Cetaphil is a fantastic product. Oh, you have this, I remember there was a product called Sculpture, which is a biostimulatory product. Everybody didn't like the product, because they thought, oh, there were some doctors that had some side effects with the product. It was the wrong dose, the wrong constitution. And the whole change of mindset around this product, we had to do some technical things around the product, but it's also rebranding, installing enthusiasm, getting positive feedback from patients that we're treating with it. So it's also a lot about the positive energy of wins or the positive energy of having some passion. If you as a leader show up and you don't really feel passionate about the business, even on bad days, how are you thinking your colleagues are going to be feeling passionate about the business?
Yeah. Well, this is really important. I think, outside of Galderma as well, just any leaders listening or watching this, there are so many tactics, I guess you could say, or strategies that we can put in place, because it's, the last stat I want to give you from this Indeed report, because this is the one that concerns me the most. Globally, almost, I think it's 59.5%. So let's say 60% of employees stated that they feel stressed daily at work, which I'm not surprised. I wish that wasn't the case, but I think it's really hard to be able to see, if you're a strategist, to be able to see what others don't see, or, having been in sales as well, if your mind is full and you're stressed, you can't hear what, the doctor is not telling you or the customer is not telling you in that state. So in general, is there anything else that, what do you think about a stat like that? How would you approach, reversing this trend? I mean, it's global. I mean, you're one person, of course, but I hope this conversation will spark some ideas for others. Because the other thing is, I don't think, I feel like we deserve to feel good more days than not. And then performance usually follows as well.
Yeah, I think in an organization like ours, where we're very dependent on our customer-facing organization, I would face, and I have focused a lot on, are we doing enough for our customer-facing organization? Are we giving them enough support? They're often lonely situations. They drive around in their car seeing customers. And you've been there, I've been there. And these are one of the toughest jobs in our industry, because you may run into a practice, you sit in the waiting room, you get no time or very little time, and you're sitting with 6 other competitors, that also want to get time. So you need a lot of mental. So making sure the first line managers, but I always go back to the thing. If people feel they work on great products, if the managers are well trained, if the mood in the company, if you celebrate wins, if you have president's clubs or wins, or then people can, so to speak, take the stress and take the thing that happens. But you need to make sure that the people seeing the customers every day, if they start being negative or stressed or not positive about the company, then you have a real problem, because maybe a few of us in headquarters, we can maybe be stressed and not positive. But if the people that come and represent the company, so I'm always looking at, also when I go to meetings, I try to be cheerful. I talk to everybody. One thing that people always say, it's a little bit strange with you. I was in China, I walked around and gave everybody the hand. I basically said, yes, of course you can be on stage, but going to each person, even though it took, I don't know how long time, to go around and thank everybody, to thank them, to feel, how are you doing, and remember the names if you've seen them a few times before, or if you see them again, not say hello to them again because you already forgot that you already said hello to them. So I think the small things in life,
details,
and I always start all the presentations. It's not about me. It's not about the results. It's some new great product or some feedback we got, because I think in the end, if you work on products, you work in a company, you feel, wow, this is cool. Everybody's energized. If the CEO is kind of not energized or not positive, then we have an issue, I think. And never forget that the real difference. Yes, we all have great people in R&D. We have great people in our operations, manufacturing, in marketing. But in the end, if the people that see the customers every day, if they're not positive, not enthusiastic, don't really like the products, you have an issue. So that's where you should focus on.
I want to respect your time, so I'm going to start. I only have a couple more questions with you, but you can probably sense as I can go on for hours under these lights with you. It's been such an honor. I have a question for you around who would you like to learn from? Is there anyone that you would love for me to interview and be in this seat, whether that's someone you know or don't know, and what would you like to know about their thinking?
Yeah, so of course, there are a lot of very inspirational CEOs. I get more my inspiration from things I like and love, like, for instance, soccer. So you mentioned tennis, Roger Federer. I follow intensely soccer.
Okay.
And they're just some of the coaches that I intensely admire, like Pep Guardiola, who is Manchester City. Year after year after year, you win trophies. How do you do that? It's like, yes, you have the money, you have great players. Carlo Ancelotti in Real Madrid, how does he, with a team of, I'm sure, very big egos that maybe each are a little bit out for themselves, and he has a big squad, he has to fit them in. How do people like that talk about our stress? What about the stress that you twice a week have to deliver results with 100,000 spectators plus millions on TV? Yeah. How do you stay calm? How do you deliver the results? And it's very interesting because, of course, it's a field that interests me. Like a person like Pep Guardiola, everybody knows nothing is left to coincidence. He studies everything. He's very meticulous. He's always on the pitch. He's watching every player. He's great at, encouraging the players, knowing, Carlo Ancelotti looks this laid back, but he is intensely into every detail. He encourages his players. He can manage a big squad. So I think if you want to learn about intense people, company, organization management, I think some of those coaches, and you can be in other sports. You could be in basketball, you could be in football, you could be in baseball. There are many other sports. But I think some of these people, the stress that we have as CEOs is nothing compared to some of these coaches. And many of them only survive for a year, two or three. Looking at them, how they change small things, work on the small details, change the game, adapt to the competitor, adapt to the opponent. I think that's really so inspiring.
Well, I'm going to make it a personal mission to network my way to one of those individuals, and hopefully I can share that interview with you, because I agree. I think it would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and also they get the microphone straight into the head, whether they won the game or lost the game. And you have all the stress, all the adrenaline. And I think some of them, you look at how composed they are. Somehow, even if they lost, they somehow either take the blame themselves, they focus on the next game, they get the big picture out. There's so much to learn from people like that.
I think it comes back to, or reminds me of, again, this theme of effortlessness and Roger and what we talked about, and a lot of those same characteristics, I think, flip over to the work that you're doing. There's a lot in the behind the scenes, right? That's allowing that perceived calm and whatnot to be showcased, which...
Yeah, but these great coaches also talk about the team, the performance, about their players. Yeah. It's not about them. They could talk about themselves. Sure. Carlo Ancelotti just, won the Ballon d'Or as the best coach. He could talk about himself, but he's talking about the players.
So Flemming, you're at your 5-year anniversary at Galderma. I'd love to know what you're most proud of.
Well, so what am I most proud of? I think the mission was clear from the beginning. The investor that bought the business, which was a division of Nestle, wanted to get to an exit, meaning either a public listing or something else. And so we did an IPO this year. I think a very successful one. So in terms of what I promised the investors, we accomplished. But what I'm most proud of is the team that we built. I think we have put a lot of new products into the market. We have 3 businesses that are all thriving. We have gone into 90 plus countries.
Wow.
We have tripled the growth. We think we have phenomenal outlook for the business. So I think building a team, setting a business plan, executing on the business plan, creating an IPO. And so I would say phase 1, which is what we were set out to do, we will do now, I think is even more exciting because now we have a better pipeline. We are in more countries. We have a lot of growth opportunities. So I think the next 5 years is going to be even more exciting.
Wow, that was going to be my follow-up question. So maybe I'll just ask you, if you had to pick one word to describe the next phase, what would you want that word to be?
Growth.
Yes, well said. Last question for you. I'll come full circle to kind of how we started this conversation, and that's once you're physically gone from this planet. If I were to sit down with your now teenage kids, how do you hope they would describe their father?
I hope, and I've at least heard them say that, I think I'm a good coach for them. I think I give them all the space that they need. I know how different they are. I want their success, whatever they decide to do, to be their success. My role is to take some of my experience and help them along the way. But I think the best thing you can do with your kids is to give them a lot of freedom, encourage them, stay within when things are not going the right way, and be supportive almost irrespective of what they do.
Well, they're definitely lucky to have you as a mentor. And I just want to thank you, Flemming, for making time to be here and have this conversation. But also a higher thank you in you being you and the path and the journey you've gone on, and always coming back to the plan and staying focused and all the tips and tricks that you shared in this conversation, because it's the impact isn't just with you. It's kind of how we started this conversation with even the crew here. It's exponential. And for that, I thank you for staying steadfast and doing what you do every day. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for having me. Enjoy the conversation.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience and their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call. I talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.